Good morning, lovelies. Today's video is a little more serious and academic in nature than the others on this channel. We're going to talk about toxic masculinity in fiction. Because of the nature of toxic masculinity, how it dismisses the ideas, opinions, and experiences of anyone other than masculine men, I am not expecting to change anyone's opinions in this video. That's not what this is about. If you're caught in toxic masculinity's limited worldview, you're not gonna listen to a woman, even if she is pointing out a genuine social concern. What I'm hoping to achieve in this video is to help people spot toxic masculinity's messages in media, that is, books, movies, and TV shows, so they can more easily dismiss those messages, ideally throwing those stories in the trash pile, and then spot healthy masculinity in other stories and share those around the community. Before we get started, remember to click the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss another video. I post every Sunday. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. All the links are in the description. Also in the description, I am adding my list of sources for this video. I do recommend you check them out. Let's start by defining our terms. What is toxic masculinity? A lot of people hear the phrase and immediately think that we are labeling all of masculinity toxic, which is not true. Saying toxic masculinity is like saying bad apples. Not all apples are bad, except for so-called delicious red. Ugh. But there's definitely a subset that is rotten to the core. Masculinity, in and of itself, is an umbrella term that covers a set of attributes typically associated with men and boys. It usually includes stuff like physical strength, courage, providing for yourself and your family, leadership, being assertive, independence, and ideally a six-pack and biceps the size of your head. Compare this with femininity, which usually includes such traits as gentleness, empathy, nurturing, being passive, servitude, having a Barbie or princess phase in your childhood, that sort of thing. Since masculinity and femininity are offshoots of gender, which in and of itself is a social construct that is constantly in flux, it's different in every culture, subculture, and person. Ask 100 different men what it means to be a man, and you'll get 100 different answers. Same with women and femininity. It is almost impossible to pin down an exact definition. I could go all day on this. Some people make it their whole career, but at some point I'd like to get on to the point of the video, so we'll just leave it at this. Masculinity is like apples. Lots of variety, lots of ways of presentation, and more than a handful of rotten ones. Toxic masculinity is a set of traits within masculinity that are cranked up to 11 and are extremely harmful, both to the person perpetuating it and everyone around them. So, for example, a general masculine trait is being stoic, being able to control your emotions in stressful situations until you're in a safe enough space to let go. It's a good leadership skill. No one wants to be jerked around by their emotions. Toxic masculinity is suppressing those emotions, ignoring them, bottling them up in the hope that they'll go away. Because boys don't cry, ever. That's BS. A healthy masculine person will, of course, express their emotions in a healthy way. A general masculine trait is being assertive or a leader. Toxic masculinity must be in control at all times and will use violence to keep it that way. Sexism and homophobia are large parts of toxic masculinity. Shaming someone for acting girly or being gay, ostracizing gay and transgender peers, belittling, abusing, and assaulting women. Left unchecked, toxic masculinity can even lead to mass shootings. See the Chicago Tribune article in the description. Basically, toxic masculinity is when a guy acts like a total asshole and then uses the fact that he's a man to excuse the behavior. This has the expected result of hurting others, both emotionally and physically. The fact that so many women are sexually assaulted by men in our society is a classic result of toxic masculinity. It also has damaging effects on the men's psyche. Men are more than 3 times more likely to commit suicide than women, in large part because toxic masculinity teaches them that they cannot be vulnerable around others or show emotion, 2 things that are mandatory for humans' mental health. Now, I know that there are some of you who are immediately going to ask, well, what about toxic femininity? Alright, I'll humor you. According to Psychology Today, toxic femininity does exist. It, quote, encourages silent acceptance of violence and domination in order to survive. It's a thing women do to keep our value, which the patriarchy has told us is conditional upon our ability to bear violent domination, end quote. Toxic femininity is the internalized acceptance of toxic masculinity. It's what leads to eating disorders in women, the belief that a woman cannot exist without marrying a man, the fact that women go in and out of domestic violent relationships because they've normalized the behavior. That is toxic femininity. Unlike toxic masculinity, victims of toxic femininity tend to hurt themselves for the comfort and approval of others, particularly men. Toxic masculinity is far more likely to be a danger to others. Modern media has already started addressing toxic femininity, albeit probably by accident, with better femme role models. For all my bitching about how women in stories are written, there has been a marked improvement in the last few decades. But media has been much slower to address the other side of the coin, toxic masculinity, which is why we're talking about it today. Let's look at some examples of this in popular media. Noah Calhoun in The Notebook. Yes, he's romantic and adorable. He also only got Allie to date him because he threatened to throw himself from the top of a Ferris wheel. This is called emotional abuse. He refuses to let Allie make her own choice in her love life and so forces her hand by threatening himself. She should have just let him drop. Jim Preston from Passengers condemns a woman to a long, lonely death because she's pretty and he doesn't want to be alone. And then he lies about it to try to cover up. Worst hero ever. Beauty and the Beast is a more controversial example, though most of the controversy is on Belle and whether or not she's a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. I personally would argue that she isn't, since she attempted to run away literally the night she was kidnapped and then chose to help the Beast after he got hurt rescuing her, so it's proven from the start that she can leave anytime she wants. The Beast, on the other hand, is rarely analyzed as closely as Belle. I'm sure I can make a video just on why that is. I'm not going to do a whole thesis on it here. Kidnapping her in exchange for her father, dick move. And he was probably only in the forest when he rescued her from the wolves to try to bring her back to the castle by force, because why else would he be out there? But after some key character development, he does become less toxic. He treats her with respect, takes a genuine interest in her hobbies, and lets her go to save her father. She doesn't fall in love with him until after he becomes a good person, rewarding him for finally treating her properly. So, gray area? Can we all agree at least that we should not be teaching our boys to kidnap the women that they want to date? That's probably a bad message. Edward Cullen from Twilight is probably the most well-known example of toxic masculinity. He full-on stalks Bella, constantly obsessing over her and acting possessive, to the point of reading her mind and controlling her behavior even after they've broken up. And the other leg of the love triangle isn't much better, since Jacob assaults her, and then when he realizes his soul bond thing that he thought was for her is actually for her unborn child, he decides to full-on groom the kid, preparing her for the day when she'll be his mate. Even Han Solo from Star Wars fits the definition of toxic masculinity. He doesn't respect Leia. He constantly dismisses and belittles her even after they start dating. It is no surprise that their relationship didn't last. In fact, I'm surprised it went on as long as it did. Leia has more self-respect than that. More subtle examples of toxic masculinity are most commonly found in action movies. Think about literally every action hero you've ever seen. They're all usually the same Dorito-shaped body type, they all handle their problems with violence, a problematic staple of the genre, and none of them get to show any emotion besides anger. Steve Rogers, as an example, was torn from everything he's ever known and loved, but he only gets misty-eyed twice in the entire franchise. The movies, and honestly the other characters, don't give him time to properly process anything and grieve. The best he can hope for is funneling his anger toward alien armies, which is not healthy. Thor is handled even worse. The guy loses his home, his dad, his mom, his best friend, his brother, and literally everything else. He doesn't show a whole lot of emotion on it. And when he finally snaps and becomes visibly depressed, all the other characters mock him for it, joking about his symptomatic weight gain. They should have been at least as concerned about him as everyone's been about Tony Stark's health. Recently, some movies have allowed their male characters to have PTSD after a really traumatic experience, which is realistic. But that's usually the only time a man is allowed to express fear and grief. He doesn't get to do that until after he has experienced a horrific experience, and then once he's diagnosed, he has to get over it in time to save the world again. Poor Tony Stark only gets to deal with his trauma in one of his many movies before being thrown into battle again. That's not how this works. You guys are seeing a trend, right? Everyone who expresses toxic masculinity in these movies are protagonists. People we're supposed to root for and identify with. They treat women like props and suppress everything with zero repercussions, like some sort of sexist robot. One movie that subverts toxic masculinity very well is Ralph Breaks the Internet. Ralph displays classic toxic traits. He's possessive about his friend Vanellope and doesn't want her to move on to a bigger and better life because it means leaving him behind. He tries to trick and manipulate her into staying with him, and it doesn't work. When his toxic masculinity takes the form of a literal monster, Vanellope deploys a tactic common among people trapped in an abusive relationship. I'll stay with you if you stop trying to hurt me. The beauty of this movie is that Ralph wins because he has to confront the manifestation of his toxicity. He has to accept the fact that his friend is moving on to bigger and better things, and he has no right to stop her. Ultimately, the day is saved and they continue to be friends, albeit now at a distance. But Ralph Breaks the Internet is in a very thin minority of movies. Most of them either don't seem to realize that they're promoting toxic masculinity, or they do know and don't care. So why should we care about any of this? Heroes in popular movies act like jerks. Whoop-de-doo, right? Then don't watch it. It's just a movie, just a book, just a story. It's not real. Who cares? Here's the problem. Fiction does affect reality.
The way the media influences the way we think is much less immediate and much less a sort of straightforward impact on the way we think. And it's much more a question of creating a certain environment of images that we grow up in and that we become used to. And after a while, those images will begin to shape what we know and what we understand about the world. And that's not an immediate kind of whiz-bang effect. That's a slow, accumulative effect, and it's much more subtle.
When you see so much of something, it's only natural that you not only normalize it, but learn from it. Fiction has an amazing power that's not really understood. For some historical examples, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe dealt a massive blow to slavery when it was published, turning more people into abolitionists on the eve of the Civil War. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair helped create the FDA. While both were based in real life, they were also both fiction, not real. On a smaller scale, studies show that romantic comedies are detrimental to real-life relationships because they do such a bad job of portraying a realistic romance. But people still absorb the messages of what a romantic relationship should be, and they apply that to their real relationships, and when they find that their real-life relationship is lacking, it falls apart. It's the same concept with toxic masculinity. Think of toxic masculinity like a house. Every movie that encourages or dismisses that kind of behavior, every rape joke, every song with degrading lyrics is one brick that goes into that house. One or two bricks aren't going to cause a whole lot of fuss. It's easy to call them out and to get rid of them. But when you have an entire culture's worth of experiences that create, teach, and encourage toxic masculinity, you end up with the whole goddamn mansion. People learn more from entertaining stories than they do from school. In part because we're hardwired to. We've been doing this for thousands of years. And in part because we're actually paying attention to these stories rather than whatever our English teacher is trying to tell us about Shakespeare. So we have to think carefully about what people are learning from them. In other words, it's not just a story. It's a lesson on how people should behave and treat each other. And right now, the lesson we're telling our men and boys is that they'll only truly be considered men if they overcome their problems with violence, treat anyone physically weaker than them as inferior, and look at women as objects to win. So what now? Where do we go from here? The unfortunate truth is that media is but one face of culture. It is intertwined with but does not control our sports, our schools, or our legal systems that also help teach and support toxic masculinity. But it is a great starting point because media is something that many people absorb every day. It starts the conversation. A little while ago, when Game of Thrones was at its most popular, there was that big debate about whether it was a good thing to portray all those rape scenes and violence against women or a bad thing. Is it good that George R.R. Martin is at least addressing these concerns, or is it contributing to the normalization of violence against women? And some people argued that whether he was right or wrong to include that isn't nearly as important as the fact that it started a widespread conversation about violence against women in media and history, about patriarchal systems, and about rape. But we're already talking about it, so it's time to go a step further. Colin Stokes did this great TED Talk that I've linked in the description about what movies teach about manhood. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he said that we have plenty of femme characters who teach girls how to stand up to the patriarchy, but almost no men characters to teach boys how to do the same. Rather, the most popular role models we currently have for boys teach them how to perpetuate it. In order to address and stop toxic masculinity on the media front, we need to shift our focus away from the femme characters and focus more on the men. Dear Lord, I never thought I'd have to say that sentence. But it's true. We need to pay close attention to how the men characters interact with women and other men in stories. And there is one stellar example that I'd like to submit as to what writers need to aspire to. Lord of the Rings. You thought I was going to say Avatar: The Last Airbender, didn't you? That's a really good example too. Avatar does a great job of normalizing male emotion, boys crying, solving your problems with something other than violence, but I'm choosing Lord of the Rings because A, unlike Avatar, all the major characters are adults, not children, and B, almost everyone has seen or at least heard of Lord of the Rings. In Lord of the Rings, and I'm sorry, I'm using the movie example, not the books, the men are very soft and compassionate toward each other. Aragorn and the hobbits are especially open with their emotions. Almost all the men jump to support each other emotionally. Aragorn is brave, physically strong, a great fighter, basically the typical example of masculinity. But he's also very soft and empathetic, and this is what makes him a great leader. The amount of forehead kisses and hugs the man gives out should become its own currency. And this is true for the other characters as well. Frodo has a total emotional breakdown near the end of the second movie, understandably. But rather than belittle him or tell him to man up, Sam agrees with him that they're in a crappy situation and supports him through it. And in fact, his impassioned speech changes Faramir's mind about turning the ring over to his father and lets them continue on their quest. Think about how that scene would normally be written today. Frodo would have his breakdown, give his defeated, "I can't do this, Sam," and Sam would haul him up to his feet and say, "Yes, you can. Now quit whining and help me figure a way out of this." Doesn't work. Gimli is probably the most stoic character of the entire Fellowship, but while he never is quite as showy with his emotions as Aragorn and the hobbits, he doesn't hesitate to support his friends when they're going through a tough time. His defining narrative arc is his growing friendship with Legolas and vice versa. They both have to let go of the harmful stereotypes that they both grew up with concerning the other species, and as a result, create one of the most beautiful friendships in fiction. The only time toxic masculinity enters the picture is with Boromir, and that's when he's being actively corrupted by the ring. As we see in his death scene and in the flashback with Faramir, he's a very different person when the ring isn't turning him into a dick. Frodo gradually becomes more toxic too, as the trilogy goes on and the ring further corrupts him, but it's portrayed as what it is, horrible and wrong, and the only way they can stop it is by chucking that jewelry in the lava. As soon as the ring is gone, Frodo stops being toxic. There are a couple of other examples like T'Challa in Black Panther, Bo and She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, Avatar: The Last Airbender, but they're vastly outnumbered by toxic male characters. So if you know of any other shows, movies, and books that portray healthy masculinity, especially in science fiction and fantasy, put them in the comments so we can check them out. Thank you. That is it for today. If you liked this video, hit subscribe. I post every Sunday. Share your examples of toxic masculinity in genre fiction below, as well as where you've seen healthy masculinity portrayed. I'll see you all next week. Bye, lovelies.